Here's Bob Reich.
Martin Gillens of Princeton and Benjamin Page of Northwestern did a study even before Citizens United and found that the impact on major pieces of legislation, even of average citizens banding together, was negligible. It was less than 1%. It was almost all big corporations and Wall Street and big money. And that was regardless of the party, and that was regardless of the year. They looked at years where Democrats were in control and Republicans were in control. The combination of concentrated income and wealth with political power through this vast system of money in politics. This is why the system has gone so off track.
That was Bob Reich. This is another fun episode of the Ezra Klein Show, a Vox.com podcast. Reich co-founded the American Prospect. That gave me my first job in journalism. But what's really interesting right now about Reich is that despite his long relationship with the Clintons, through his words and through his videos, he's become maybe the most influential and widely read and viewed supporter of Bernie Sanders. This has been a big deal. His videos on Facebook have racked up at this point about 80 million views, and he's really made the case for Sanders more eloquently and more persuasively than anyone else out there, particularly around inequality and issues of power. I've not gotten here to his run for governor of Massachusetts, or his many books, or the documentary he made, or the endless list of awards you can find on his Wikipedia page. He's lived a very interesting life. It's a very fun conversation. He's an incredible storyteller and really, really fast thinker on his feet. Just a lot of fun to talk to. I hope you enjoy it. You talked about being involved in a group that began an experimental college at Dartmouth.
We thought the best way of organizing education was to give people the opportunity to teach and to learn what they wanted to. And it was essentially a kind of a glorified bulletin board where anybody could say, look, I'm interested in learning more about this, or I'm interested in teaching this other thing. And it was pre-computer days, ways people could actually come together. We ended up with about 40 courses open to anybody in the community, any students. For at least a couple of years, it really went like gangbusters. And it was a different philosophy of education. And there was embedded there a distrust, or at least a suspicion, of hierarchies. Much of university education is still built around a model that came to us directly from the 17th century, from Oxford and Cambridge. Lectures, students sitting passively, taking notes. It's certainly not learn what you want, teach what you want. Everybody has certain degrees of knowledge and certain capacities, and certainly their own motivation. It is based around grades and tests. Jay Kornbluth, very talented director, came and wanted to do a film about inequality, and he sat in on my class at Berkeley, and then we made a film out of that called Inequality for All. Even though I've been writing for 30 years, more people have seen Inequality for All, and more people have seen the 2-minute, 3-minute videos that we do on Facebook than have ever read any one of my books. Part of the reason that I endorse Bernie Sanders is because I think that he does represent a kind of movement politics that we need in America in order to get anything done, proportional to the degree of problem we face in terms of concentrated income, wealth, and political power. Obviously, this degree of concentrated income, wealth, and power has grown up over the past 30 or 35 years. But now that we have this, we need a movement to create a kind of countervailing power in order to take on the vested interests that have gained extraordinary control over our entire political system. It's no longer enough simply to talk about good policy. Policy discussion is cheap. It's becoming increasingly irrelevant because without a political will and political power and a movement behind all of that political will and political power, no policy is going to be put into effect. The assumption was that American politics was laid out on a long continuum from left to right. You wanted to go to the center because that's where all the votes were. That was the way we thought about politics. But what it leaves out is this widening inequality over the last several decades. And it's not just economic. It is also political, and it has to do with political power, according to almost every study on this issue.
The vast majority of Americans feel a high degree of powerlessness.
They just don't feel like they've got any say, any control. The work of political scientists across the spectrum bears them out.
Money talks
Politics are dominated by a handful of people.
The voice of average Americans now is less potent
than it has been at any time in the post-war era. And so the left-right continuum is beside the point. The real divide is establishment versus anti-establishment. That is, do you feel like the game is rigged against you, and what are you going to do about it? Or are you among the riggers of the game?
The left-right continuum is beside the point.
The real divide is, do you feel like the game is rigged against you, and
what are you going to do about it?
That is not as easily portrayed or understood as left versus right. It's much more about power. The subject that we don't really like to talk about very much in America, Bernie Sanders has put very central to his campaign, but it is now also becoming a central issue in the Republican Party. I do see the Trump phenomenon as another aspect of this anti-establishment fury against the people who have power, who have really rigged the game in their own interest and against the vast majority. And that's the most significant aspect of the new politics, the politics that is born in the 2008 financial crisis, the Tea Partiers and the occupiers on different sides, but reacting to the bailout of Wall Street, the Tea Partiers against government, the occupiers against Wall Street, but they're the two sides of the same coin. The Tea Partiers and the occupiers on different sides of the same coin.
Wall Street, the government, they're two sides of the same coin.
The Tea Partiers and that movement becomes, to some extent, a progenitor of a new Republican politics of which Donald Trump is part and I think in some important ways represents. And obviously Bernie Sanders is kind of the direct linear descendant of the Occupy movement.
When I hear people say money is the core driver of outcomes in American politics, I'm skeptical.
Well, I think you're taking too limited a view of what money buys and what it doesn't buy. What money buys is not just votes. It's not just a purchase of an individual vote. Money buys the agenda, what gets on the agenda.
It's not just a purchase of an individual vote. It is the set of assumptions about what's politically possible.
For example, the carried interest loophole is an abomination. It's for hedge fund and private equity managers. It has no economic justification. Everybody on all sides of it says it should not exist. Nothing ever happens to it. It stays there. It is not on anybody's agenda. Simply look at the overwhelming power of think tanks and what money has bought in terms of expertise, and the academic experts and other experts constantly being trotted out in congressional hearings and on television. The propaganda machines that money has bought, the media time and attention that money has bought, the ways in which what is taken for granted as not possible or being possible is characterized by money. In the late 1960s, 3% of retiring members of Congress became lobbyists.
Now, almost 50% of retiring members of Congress become lobbyists, and they do it because of the money.
And when half of your entire members of Congress, congressional delegations, know that they're going to become lobbyists, you don't think that affects how they think about their patrons and what they are willing to talk about and what they're willing to put on the agenda and not? Of course it does. It's the culture that has changed. It is the set of assumptions about what's politically possible.
It's the entire frame of reference.
And if you get out of Washington, out of the Beltway, out of New York, and you go to talk to people, you find the degree of cynicism on both the left and the right about what almost all of them are now calling crony capitalism. They know in their gut that
the system is rigged
against them. Even when Democrats had a majority, proposals to get rid of carried interest went nowhere. I mean, even Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat, was against getting rid of the loophole, and he told me he was against it because he thought that focusing on hedge fund managers and private equity managers was unfair. You should actually focus on everybody who takes advantage of it. Well, maybe he was sincere, but I have been in room after room, meeting after meeting, where people say, oh, we've got to get rid of it, and then there's a kind of nod and wink. Everybody knows it's never going to be got rid of. And why is that? It's because of political power. More and more concentration, market power, about the basic building blocks of capitalism. Look at property. What is property? Why are drug prices so high in America, much higher per capita than they are in other places that are advanced industrial countries? Because we allow pharmaceutical companies to pay generic manufacturers of pharmaceuticals to not introduce their generic versions until years after the patents run out.
That's pay for delay. No other country allows that.
It's costing Americans billions of dollars.
We don't have a national health system that bargains down the prices, but they did make the tax code markedly more progressive. Obamacare fundamentally is a healthcare subsidy to poor people paid for by a sharp tax increase on rich people, and then cuts to the Medicare Advantage program, which is a pretty sharp cut of a subsidy to the insurance companies. And you don't see that vote structured by which members of the Senate came from states with a large health insurance concentration. You only see it structured by anything but pure partisanship. Virtually every Democrat votes for, every Republican votes against it. That is how the vote looks on virtually every major piece of legislation in the Obama era. Our politics has been broken by the fact that it requires compromise in an era when the parties have gotten too far apart to compromise. There's this great research from Francis Lee out of University of Maryland showing that when the president takes a position even on a non-controversial issue, it sharply increases the chances of a party line vote.
Money is still a powerful driver in politics, and the evidence is you've got to buy off all of these industries in order to make a coalition that will support whatever you want to do. Even if you get rid of partisanship, you still are going to have, with all of this money, with the dominance of large corporations and Wall Street and now increasingly billionaires, you're still going to have a system incapable of responding to the public interest without these payoffs. With all of this money, with the dominance of large corporations and Wall Street and now increasingly billionaires, even if you get rid of partisanship, you're still going to have
a system incapable of responding to the public interest without payoffs.
I think the Affordable Care Act marked an extraordinary achievement, but it was the kind of achievement that was only possible because the pharmaceutical industry was bought off, because part of the healthcare industry was bought off, and that was expensive. That is a politics that ultimately is too expensive to maintain. So if you deal with the partisanship problem and you don't deal with the money problem, you're not really anywhere.
Did you feel when you ran the Department of Labor that choices you could make were highly bounded by money?
Pre-Citizens United, mid-1990s, money was big. It was important. Countervailing power in terms of unions and small businesses was already declining. The money was increasing from the big corporations, Wall Street, and very rich individuals, those major centers of power. As a cabinet secretary, if I thought it was a good idea to move on a regulation that limited where workers could smoke, well, we tried, but I couldn't get that done. The Tobacco Institute and its allies in the business community just hammered that regulation. There was no hope for that.
What did they do?
They organized Congress. I was getting calls from not just Republicans. I was getting calls from a lot of Democrats, members of Congress, representatives, not just tobacco states, but all over the place, from the authorization committees of Congress who oversaw the Labor Department. They said, just don't do that. The implicit threat is you're not going to get an appropriation to carry on your work in the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. We're going to slash its budget. Or if you try to do something else that we don't like, for example, impose very, very strict constraints on institutions that handle pensions. Regulations may be fairer to pensioners, but if you make it just more difficult for us, we're going to beat you back. We're going to cut your appropriation. In the late 1970s, I was at the Federal Trade Commission when the business community was just becoming organized in Washington, and we wanted to regulate advertising of very sweet, sugary cereal and soft drinks directed at children. And again, we were threatened. I was part of meetings in which Republicans, Democrats in Congress would say, if you do that, we are cutting back the appropriation of the Federal Trade Commission. In fact, there were a couple of weeks there in the late 70s where the Federal Trade Commission was closed because it's an independent regulatory agency, and the chairman said, we're going to go ahead. And Congress said, well, okay, if you're going to do that, we're going to close you down. Big corporations have armies, platoons of lawyers who descend on the regulatory rulemaking process and not only delay it, but if they don't like something, they will threaten to appeal to the federal courts. An additional delay And that threat doesn't have to be carried out many times before the agency says, okay, we'll compromise, we'll do as much as you can. Look at Dodd-Frank, financial reform bill that was supposed to clean up Wall Street, left most of the details to the agencies, the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation, the FDIC, the SEC. Those agencies have for years been under siege by huge numbers of lawyers and lobbyists representing the interests of the big banks, and they've been watering down Dodd-Frank every week. I mean, delaying and watering down. It is quiet. It is hidden from public view. It is a way in which
money has a huge and hidden influence.
If the public doesn't understand what's going on, they fall for the political platitude and mythology that there's a choice here between the free market and government. And if you believe in the free market, you're conservative, and if you want more government, you're liberal or progressive, without understanding that you can't have a market unless you have rules, laws, regulations. The real issue is
who has most influence over those rules.
Is it a smaller and smaller, more and more powerful group of corporations and financial institutions and billionaires, or is it what we like to think of as a democracy? And unfortunately, it's become a smaller and smaller group. If I were conspiratorially minded, I might think that they advance the mythology of this choice between free market and government in order to distract attention from what they're doing every day.
Dean Baker, who's an economist in Washington, wrote a book called Loser Liberalism. The fundamental point in that book is that liberalism and in general government has this problem of trying to manage and affect the economy through taxation. That there are all these things we have done to structure the rules of the game. There's only going to be so much we can ever do through taxes, that ultimately is not going to be enough. And Baker's point is that you have to be willing to ask yourself about the structure that is creating this kind of compensation distribution, not just trying to change the distribution on the back end.
I not only agree with it, but I've written about it. My latest book, Saving Capitalism, explores the ways in which the system is rife with upward distributions from average working people and the poor to the big corporations, their major investors and stockholders and top executives, through hidden upward distributions manipulated through very, very low visibility rulemakings, regulations, and laws that are complicated that nobody pays attention to. Dean is absolutely right that by paying attention instead to the redistribution after the market has done all of this hidden upward predistribution, we end up losing sight of what's really occurring. By paying attention to the redistribution after the market has done all of this hidden upward predistribution, we end up losing sight of what's really occurring. If we got rid of the upward predistributions, we wouldn't need nearly as many downward post-distributions.
If we got rid of the upward predistributions, we wouldn't need downward post-distributions.
Give me 3 upward predistributions that you would get rid of.
One has to do with monopolization. Antitrust has been on the back burner now for years. There's too much concentration in airlines, in healthcare, in banking, in cable broadband, in industry after industry, which means that not only are consumers paying too much, but you also have more and more political power in the hands of fewer and fewer people and actors in an industry that in turn can get more favors, corporate welfare, or changes in the rules that benefit them.
So you're saying antitrust is not strengthened in recent years?
No, it's weakened. Cable used to be not concentrated. In fact, 20 years ago, there are many, many more cable operators, mostly regional and local. Now you've got 3 or 4 big ones. Airlines, 14 major airlines. 20 years ago, now we're down to 4 major airlines. And even though fuel prices have plummeted, airline ticket prices haven't gone down very much. Or look at the middlemen in the agricultural industry. You've got still a lot of small farmers, but the big processors are the ones who are raking in the money. Monsanto and others, they're not just monopolists, they're monopsonists in the sense that they have enormous power over their suppliers. And even in high tech, the more dominant Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple become, the more power they have over everybody who not only wants to buy in, but everybody who wants to provide content and anybody who wants to supply anything. They have essentially monopolies over their digital platforms, their software. I think antitrust can be subtle. Google could be forced to share some of its proprietary software with some potential competitors, even make it public. Google is now the #1 lobbyist in Washington. That would reduce its market power significantly and also its political power. But my point is that antitrust really does need to be reinvigorated. Antitrust is about politics. It's not just about economics, and it needs to be understood in its political dimension. I would also look at bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is now basically tilted, rigged in favor of the biggest corporations and the richest individuals like Donald Trump, a serial bankruptcy user. But if you are a student debtor, loaded 20 years out with student loans, you still cannot pay, you are not able to reorganize that debt under bankruptcy because the major corporations and lenders and financiers have exercised a great deal of power. If you're a homeowner and you're underwater, you can't use bankruptcy to reorganize your mortgage debt. Again, that's
because of who has had control over the bankruptcy laws.
The third area I'd look at is finance more broadly, the ways in which we have tried to deal with the problems of financial cartelization and centralization in the form of the biggest Wall Street banks are just wrong. You can't do it through regulation. I think Dodd-Frank was a good attempt, but it's proving to be inadequate.
You mentioned earlier you've endorsed Bernie Sanders, and you've been very influential in support.
Right now, I think it's very important to not only be supportive of Bernie Sanders, but also to take seriously and to value what he is putting on the public agenda. Sometimes old friends will say, well, don't you owe it to the Clintons to support Hillary? And I say, yes, but I also have some responsibility to the understandings I have of American politics and what we need. I ask myself, who's best positioned to change the system? Who is the kind of person who would help create or help lead a movement toward the kind of system we need? And that leads me to Bernie Sanders. I personally believe that Hillary Clinton is the most qualified to be president of the system we have now. But the system we have now is corrupt. It is dysfunctional. I don't think that she will change the structure of power in America. She's not a movement leader. If she is president, I expect she will do what Obama has done. That is, take the current structure of power and to make the deals that are possible within that structure in a way that helps the most people. It would be kind of McCarthy-esque to assume that anybody who is good friends with Wall Street and takes vacations in the East Hamptons, $200,000 a month houses, that immediately disqualifies them from being a major social reformer. I don't want to say that. But certainly I have seen again and again how your social circle does affect your worldview. You begin to see the world through the eyes of others in that social circle. And it's very subtle. It's very insidious. In the Clinton administration, I liked Bob Rubin, who was head of the National Economic Council, ultimately became Secretary of the Treasury. Personally, I actually enjoyed his company a great deal, and we became good friends. But I did come to understand that he was viewing America's issues, problems, challenges through the eyes of Wall Street. Head of the National Economic Council, ultimately Secretary of the Treasury, Bob Rubin
was viewing America's problems through the eyes of Wall Street.
That invariably meant that time and again, issue after issue, we were on opposite sides. You know, there's a story of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the election of 1936. He's running for re-election, and the business community is almost uniformly against him. He says he welcomes their animus. Some woman comes up to him and says, Mr. President, if you're re-elected, I want you to tell me you're going to do this and this and this and this. And he turns to her and says, ma'am, if I am re-elected, I want to do everything on your list, but if I'm re-elected, you must make me. Even in the Depression, when much of the country was behind Franklin D. Roosevelt, he still needed people to be sufficiently mobilized and organized outside Washington that he could get good things done inside Washington. You've got to have a public that is educated and is supportive of what you're doing. You've got to play the outside game at the same time by speaking to the public and mobilizing the public. Any progressive voice has got to facilitate and organize and provide the basis for a new countervailing power in America. And the absence makes it very difficult for any progressive president to get anything done, even if we didn't have the polarization in Congress. I don't think the Bernie Sanders campaign was ever about Bernie Sanders per se. It was about a movement that he channeled and personified, but that movement would have been there if any progressive leader had taken on that mantle.
What is one thing that you believe that most people think is false?
I think most people believe that there really is a fundamental choice between the free market and the government. I think the big choice is whether we have a government that's working for most people or a government that's working for a privileged and powerful elite, and that you can't separate the free market for the government because government is making the rules by which the market is organized.
What are 3 books that have influenced you greatly that you think more people should read?
Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. That is a very important book. John Kenneth Galbraith's early book, The Affluent Society, or maybe American Capitalism, The Concept of Countervailing Power, is also very important. Thorstein Veblen, his theory of the leisure class is a kind of turning point in terms of political economy and sociology. Just randomly, I take those 3.
Robert Reich, thank you so much.